In this lecture, I'm going to cover both chapters 6 and 7 for Module 4 and discuss diversity and families in early childhood education. It's important when we look at cultural diversity to understand what culture is. Here is a list of 7 characteristics that define culture. Our values, beliefs, patterns of behaviors. They're shared by groups, passed from generation to generation. It includes customs, rituals, and interactions. And it impacts our roles in our groups, as well as our relationships between each other and with other groups. So for an example, women and mothers. Some culture and subcultures of our society will have certain roles or jobs that are typically or have typically been defined by women and completed by women, or you had more father figure types of roles. Some of those gender-based ideas are becoming less common and are being challenged over the last couple generations, but you can still find them present. And so these are all important considerations when we look at culture and we talk about culture. Even within a community that is rather homogeneous, that looks to have little diversity, you do find different cultures and ideas. Culture impacts how we develop and how our children learn and grow. We are all rooted in more than one culture. When you get married, you combine cultures of two families. Sometimes they're very similar, but there are going to be differences. And so those differences kind of create a little subgroup within your life sometimes. They aren't the same. They're dynamic. They change over time. Maybe get more liberal, maybe get more conservative. Roles change for different people within a culture. So they are not always the same. They are even dynamic across regions. We can't talk about Christians. That would be considered a religion, and yet it impacts a culture. And so you can't talk about Christians as one lump group and because they are so diverse within each other. Just as an example, same can be said for race or any large groups of people. Language, ethnicity, and race. All these things impact what we believe and our perspectives, which is one reason I have to say in this class we spend so much time each module exploring our own values and how those impact the professional values and code of ethics that the National Association for the Education of Young Children have defined. It's important that we have that awareness, and that's why we do that in this class. There's differences, as I just said, within cultural groups. There's often issues of power and status, whether it has to do with money or fashion or physical fitness. It's complex. But race and culture are not the same thing. That is extremely important to remember and to know. Yes, they're often used synonymously. No, they are not the same thing. And biology is sometimes related, meaning our genetics, how we're related. Sometimes we're a member of a culture because that's what we were born into. As we think about culture, you need to understand the individual groups that within families and groups of people, as well as how they work within each other and amongst each other. That there's a continuum of values within any culture. So not just because I might identify myself with a group of people doesn't mean that we all believe exactly the same thing. That there's a continuum of belief within a general idea. And it's important to learn about other cultural groups within our communities, to understand families, to understand different religions and churches, even if they're, in Kansas, overwhelmingly church-wise, you have Christian churches. Well, but even among Christian churches, there's a wide range of beliefs. And so it's important to understand where our families are coming from, because that interaction within these other subgroups of them impact their values and what they want for their children. Again, pulling on this idea that one of the most important things we can do is to understand our own culture and cultural experiences. Be aware of those, learn about the perspective of others, and how we feel about those. Because our personal connections need to be different from our professional connections. And how do we define those both while being true to ourselves, if you will? There's some keys in our teaching when and demonstrating cultural, and I'm going to call it competence, meaning you understand culture, you are able to think critically and yet be fair and inclusive within your setting. So again, being aware of your own perspective, really truly appreciating and respecting other cultures, not just with words, but in your actions, and really analyzing what you do and how that's inclusive or exclusive. Looking at cross-cultural interactions and understanding those. Identifying resources within your community. Having that willingness to learn. Being flexible and comfortable with not knowing. And asking families. And being okay with uncertainty and answers. Helping children feel good about their culture, their family, their background, and their experiences. It's important that we all feel good and feel validated in our lives. And children will flourish when they feel validated versus judged. This means we experience and value that diversity. We participate in activities. We maybe support with fundraisers and purchasing at fundraiser times for different groups, reading about them, showing pictures and valuing, showing that value of these different experiences and diversity. Think critically about justice and fairness. Recently, a conversation came up in my own office regarding drug laws. And in the 80s and 90s, drug laws were overwhelmingly unfair. And there's still a lot of problems in our fairness in our legal system, where we have drugs that are notoriously abused by one ethnicity that have a much greater sentencing than drugs that are abused by another race. And so with this idea, the underlying value there is that we need to punish certain types of people more than others. And this is not good. This is not healthy. And some of those laws have been changed over time, recognizing the inherent discrimination that was happening. And so as teachers, that's a really grand example, but as teachers, we really have to be conscious about how we are being just and fair to our students. And then also taking action to address bias and discrimination, standing up and advocating for families within our programs and within our communities. Those are kind of heavy burdens to carry, but yet very important in a professional role. Connecting back to our previous chapter on children with special needs, I wanted to point out this quote from page 155. Admittedly, using person-first language can sometimes feel cumbersome, but language matters. How we describe people and conditions communicates our attitudes about them. Currently, person-first terms begin with the word individuals, thus emphasizing the uniqueness of each person regardless of an identified disability. In our classes, I always expect students to talk about the person first. It is a child with autism. It is not an autistic boy. It is a child with Down syndrome. It's not a Down syndrome child. It is the person first. We value people and who they are first, because we are, even within our own descriptors and groups and cultures, we are individuals. It is a form of respect. It is a form of value, and words do matter. And I very much expect all of us to use person first language in our writing and in how we talk about children, whether we're talking about a disability or race or other descriptors. We want to put the person first. So cultural responsiveness and working with families really is a cornerstone of early childhood, which is why I put these two chapters together in the same module. Because if we are responsive to the diversity in our communities that is there, whether we see it or not, it's not just race-based and it's just not language-based, but there's other types of diversity within cultures. If we recognize that when we work with families closely for the benefit of our young children, it is a cornerstone of effective and powerful early childhood education programs. Diversity in families has grown over the many generations recently in composition, being two-parent households, one-parent household, grandparents raising children, same-sex family parents, interracial families. Composition is different. Culture and religion, economic status, two-parent working households versus single-parent working households. Mobility. We move and we live away from family much more now than we ever have before. And we have families where parents are much more honest and open regarding their sexual orientation. So this leads us to this idea of families versus parents. You'll notice that our textbook says partnerships with families, not partnerships with parents. I will strongly urge you to use the term family. It is much more encompassing for the many diverse compositions of a household today. And when we use encompassing language, because language does matter, when we use terms like families versus parents, we are valuing and validating a child's experience, a child's household. So instead of having a child at the table say, well, I don't have a mom, or I don't have a dad, or I don't live with my parents, when we talk about families, we are able to encompass each of our children without singling any of them out or making any of the children feel less about themselves and their situations. Building reciprocal relationships with families can be very challenging, but it recognizes that families truly want what is best for children. I often will hear teachers complaining that the parent doesn't care or the family is being selfish. And that is one perspective. But I think if we really sit down with families and talk to the adults, we will find that everybody at the table truly wants what is best for the child. But that there are challenges and barriers sometimes to what people are wanting. That then goes hand in hand that every family has strengths and they have resources and hopes and dreams. But with those strengths, resources, hopes, and dreams come challenges, and that families face challenges. And just like families have resources, they have needs too. And that's not listed here, but Families have needs, and sometimes they don't have the resources to meet those needs, and they don't know how to have those needs met. Poverty is the largest risk factor for families and children. And we're going to talk about poverty in detail in the next slide. It's important to pull back on this idea of culture again, that families have experiences, traditions, goals, resources, and culture that are unique to them. And that's hard when we have 20 children that we work with, or 12 children, or only 6 children. It's often 6 different kinds of experiences, 6 different sets of needs, 6 different sets of strengths, and that can be challenging for us as a teacher. But if we pull back on this idea that everybody wants what's best for the child, then it really helps ground our foundation of a relationship with the family. We have to recognize that relationships are 2 ways, and that we can only control our one way, though. And so being open-minded and fair is an important step that we take with families. It will build respect, trust, and cooperation, and showing that we have a willingness to negotiate our differences, to be accommodating, to help those families face their challenges. So to talk just briefly about poverty specifically, I pulled up the Kids Count data from 2016, and we'll actually click on that here. And we know that 17.65% of young children in Kansas are living in poverty at the 100% level. And just to give you, that data is here. You scroll down to economic to here. Just to give you an understanding of what that 100% means, 100% poverty for a household of 4 is $24,600. A family of 5 is $28,780. A family of 6, $32,960. And that's 100% poverty. I don't know about you, but I do not know how a family of 4, so let's say 2 adults, 2 children, can make ends meet at $24,600 a year. That would be less than $2,000 a month. Actually, it's $2,050 a month. (49.27% of public school children participate in the free and reduced lunch programs. Free and reduced lunch programs will go up to 200% poverty level. At 200%, a family of 4 makes $49,200. That is a much healthier income. Still not enough in today's economy, but that's a much more doable figure. And so those students would be qualifying for reduced lunches. But we have almost 20% of our children living below the 100% poverty rate, which for a family of 4 is $24,600. So why is poverty such a risk factor? It's just money, right? Well, it's lack of medical care. Sure, we may have children receiving free health care, but often it's not in the best facilities with the best doctors. It's not as proactive. If you're working, we are a perfect example in our own field. As a child care provider, if you have to take off work to take your child to the doctor, you're going to take less money home. And if you have to do that too many times, you put yourself at risk of losing your job. It's very frustrating in our profession of child care and early childhood education that we are actually a large part of this working poor, where it's very obvious where this minimum wage is not enough to live on. And so we put our children are at risk. We're not doing it, purposefully. We're doing it it's circumstantial, but, so lack of medical care, poor nutrition. It is expensive to eat healthy. It is cheaper to buy the bag of chips than to bypass the chips and have a sandwich with lots of fresh fruits and vegetables. Those fresh fruits and vegetables, the lean meats, the fish and shrimp and lean chicken, it's expensive. It's more expensive than the 70% fat ground beef. There's low mobility among families that are impoverished. You move from house to house, whether it's due to job needs or poor landlords, which creates low stability for the child. There's lack of experiences or lower quality experiences. We have to opt for cheaper child care options, sometimes staying with maybe elderly family that don't have the energy to engage with our children in the way we want them to. We know based on research that there's a 30 million word gap in the first 5 years between a child living in poverty and a child living in a middle income home. Now, that's not 30 different words. That's not total. That's a gap, meaning the difference between the number of words, and you can repeat the words, but not only in the number of words, but the richness of the words, the variety in the words heard. There's a 30 million word gap between children living in poverty and children living in middle income homes. And let's face it, when there's not enough money, when we have bills overdue, it creates high stress, and it then creates mental health issues within the home. This is for anybody. It's just a nature of the beast. So barriers to communication with families include this list of competition between a teacher and a parent sometimes, who's the child going to like more, the parent feeling being judged or not being good enough, and so being defensive, guilt and loss from not being able to spend as much time with their child because they're having to go work and to make ends meet. They have different goals sometimes. Sometimes what a child care provider or teacher might think is important is not what the family values. Ends up in a power struggle sometimes based on what a family thinks should be happening in raising their child, with whether it be introducing new foods, whether it be diapering and toileting, napping habits. It becomes a power struggle of who's right and wrong. Confusion about what the rules are and policies are. Lack of flexibility, especially on the teacher and child care provider part. Lack of attention to an individual. As children get older and they get into bigger groups, there's often less attention to individual children, and it's more group oriented. The professional not being aware of communication styles and thus being able to understand both how they inherently choose to communicate and how families communicate. And then also as a professional, not being aware of our values and of our culture and our perspective, and being able to remove ourselves theoretically from a situation so that we can analyze what is going on and see the family's perspective. But we know that there are, in general, 3 effective strategies. In informal communication, it's positive, 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 that we build that positive. We don't bring in the negative. If you're working with a child every day in the family, you're not going to bring in negative comments and information probably for at least 2 months. You shouldn't. Because you are getting to know them. You're building rapport. You're building a relationship. You're creating the opportunity of trust and collaboration, so that when you do run into true challenges, you're able to approach those in a way that's effective and empowering to the family, not derogatory or negative or offensive to families. So informal communication becomes really important. Daily notes and logs, being available to chat, having weekly updates, and really using technology. A screenshot here is when I Googled daily notes and found, this is, I think, Kambu, and it's just an example of an app that you can use to share pictures, to document learning, to text parents, that then they can get in on that app. I will warn against social media. Social media is easy and it's pretty free. However, it also kind of forces families to engage in something that some do not want to engage with. I'm on Facebook. We have a Facebook page for Allen Early Childhood. But my sister, she is not on Facebook. She will never be on Facebook. Her children will never be on Facebook. And there's nothing going to change that. So if you only use social media for this kind of daily informal communication, you are limiting your audience, and you want to be careful about doing that. Where if you choose an app that can be seen via a smartphone, or on a computer, you're opening yourself up to a larger group of people. You're being more fair and equitable. So I would warn against just using social media or even just texting with families, of doing something a little more formal. I think it raises the standard and the expectations both in the family's eyes, and when you do that, you also raise the level of communication they're going to share with you. And so sometimes when we increase our quality of communication, we get back better communication too. We set the tone, if you will, for the conversation and for future conversations. Formal meetings, even in childcare, it's an important idea to have a formal meeting at a predictable time, whether it be once every 6 months, whether it be once every 3 months, once a year, but starting with positive, having work and play samples, pictures, giving and receiving information, setting goals together, using that as an opportunity to really pull on the parents' values of what they want to see happening. You could engage them around their child's birthday, perhaps, would be a good idea. There's a lot of different ways to structure this. And then the idea of family engagement. Family engagement is not just about a special activity, although donuts with dads and muffins with moms are great activities. When we think about family engagement, we should be doing it all the time in multiple ways. So special activities are definitely one of those. But also, it's us sharing child development information with families, whether it's checklists that we complete and send home so they know, or whether it's pages and printouts from the vast resources online about quality experiences at home, weighted deals with biting, how to introduce moving from a crib to a toddler or regular sized bed. There's so many resources out there nowadays for families and for providers and teachers on working with children and helping children be successful. Creating welcoming environments for families, whether it's having a good space when you first enter a classroom or a home where families can help their child unpack and get ready for the day, whether it's teaching them a drop-off routine and a pickup routine, whether it's having a place for families to be able to sit with each other or with the children as they begin or end their days. Connecting families to community resources, being knowledgeable yourself of what those community resources are so that you can help families access them when needed. Using a combination of any of these strategies, not just one. It's not a one and done thing. You need to be using a plethora of strategies that are different, targeting different audiences, bringing in different families and groups. And then really building on your assets and the family's trust of you, and using that to help get them engaged and participate and bring them in. We know that when families are involved in a child's education, the children are more successful. There are more positive feelings about school, and there are less problems. And when there are problems, they're able to be handled effectively and in a way that is least damaging to the relationship with the family. Which means then it's going to be a more positive experience for everybody, keeping the child and the child's learning at the center. So it's applying what we know. It's hard. It is a little daunting. It's unfortunate that in our schools we aren't able to, in child care centers, we aren't able to have more access to mental health providers and counselors and social workers. But it's about knowing our resources, knowing our values, and being able to see families in a good light, and seeing our differences as a positive, validating our diversity in our communities and in our programs.